wanted transparency? Be careful what you demand on live television. I know that sounds harsh, and some of you are already asking why I'm opening by criticizing Ilhan Omar instead of Kash Patel. Stay with me until the end of this video, because the reason has less to do with ideology and more to do with political miscalculation under pressure. At 11:47 a.m., 17 minutes into her questioning, the energy inside the hearing room shifted in a way that seasoned political observers immediately recognized. This was not about party lines anymore. It was about control of the stage. Ilhan Omar entered that hearing prepared to prosecute. Her posture was forward, her tone precise, her framing aggressive but disciplined. She had clearly rehearsed the narrative. Progressive members allegedly targeted, federal power allegedly weaponized, transparency allegedly overdue. Kash Patel, by contrast, was restrained, hands folded, voice measured, no theatrical gestures, no rhetorical fireworks. That contrast mattered more than most viewers realized in the moment. When Omar demanded a yes or no answer about investigations involving members of Congress, she believed she was tightening the frame. In reality, she was narrowing it in a way that reduced her own maneuvering room. Here's the critical mistake. In high-profile hearings, the person who asks the question does not automatically control the outcome. Control belongs to whoever manages tempo. Patel answered yes without hesitation. Not defensively, not defiantly, calmly. That calmness disrupted her script. The room reacted audibly, but what truly changed was perception. A confident accuser suddenly found herself needing to manage fallout from the clarity she had demanded. Transparency sounds powerful as a talking point. It becomes dangerous when you are not fully certain what the other side is prepared to disclose. Let me be clear. This was not about proving guilt or innocence. It was about political optics. When you build your brand around confronting institutions, you must anticipate that institutions might confront you back. Omar pressed harder. She cut him off. She insisted on direct answers. Strategically, that move plays well with a base that values confrontation, but it carries risk in a live setting watched by millions. Because once you insist on simplicity, you cannot retreat into nuance without appearing evasive. Patel, to his credit or to his advantage depending on your perspective, leaned into procedural language. He referenced standards. He referenced process. He referenced career agents rather than political appointees. Each phrase reinforced one message. This is about law, not politics. Whether viewers believed that framing is secondary, what mattered is that he delivered it consistently and without visible agitation. Omar, sensing momentum shifting, increased intensity. Her voice sharpened. Her cadence quickened. On YouTube clips, that reads as passion to supporters and instability to critics. And in modern media ecosystems, ambiguity in tone is rarely neutral. Here's the uncomfortable truth for anyone studying American politics seriously. Aggression is powerful when you are certain of the terrain. It is risky when the terrain contains unknown variables. The moment she asked for specifics in open session, you could almost feel experienced lawmakers in the room stiffen. It wasn't because they disagreed with her ideology. It was because they understood what open session specificity can unleash. Politics rewards boldness, but it punishes overconfidence. Now let me inject something slightly humorous but instructive. There is an old Washington saying, "Never subpoena someone unless you have already read every page they might bring with them." It sounds like a joke, but it's actually survival advice. Omar came prepared to interrogate. Patel came prepared to respond. And preparation in Washington often means anticipating not just the question, but the emotional arc of the exchange. When the room went quiet, It was not polite silence. It was evaluative silence. Cameras zoom in during silence. Social media clips silence. Silence becomes symbolism. And that is where the shift occurred. The debate stopped being about policy and started being about composure. If you are watching this thinking, why is he focusing on Omar's strategy instead of attacking Patel? The answer is simple. Political analysis is not about cheering. It is about identifying missteps. Omar's miscalculation was not ideological. It was tactical. She assumed the role of prosecutor without fully controlling the evidentiary flow. She assumed moral momentum would override procedural counterpunching. And in doing so, she underestimated how dangerous transparency can be when invoked too confidently. That does not mean Patel won on substance. It means he maintained equilibrium while she accelerated into uncertainty. And in televised political combat, equilibrium often looks like victory. This was only the beginning. The true consequences would unfold over the next several minutes, as the exchange moved from accusation to specificity and from performance to risk. If you think this was dramatic, the next phase is where the political calculus truly changed. The turning point did not arrive with shouting or chaos, but with something far more dangerous in American politics: composure under pressure meeting escalating intensity. After the initial exchange, the atmosphere inside the hearing room shifted from partisan confrontation to strategic evaluation. Members were no longer reacting as Democrats or Republicans. They were reacting as politicians who understood risk. When a debate transitions from messaging to specifics, the stakes change immediately. Omar attempted to regain control by accelerating the pace. She pressed for clarity, demanded sharper answers, and framed the issue in moral terms. From a communications standpoint, this was not irrational. Her political base responds to moral urgency. The problem was not urgency itself. The problem was the setting. Live oversight hearings are procedural battlegrounds. They are structured. They are rule-bound. They reward discipline. When one side introduces emotional escalation into a procedural arena, it creates contrast. That contrast can energize supporters, but it can also create vulnerability if the opposing side remains calm. Patel maintained a consistent rhythm. He did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice. He responded in legal language. That choice subtly reframed the confrontation from ideological to institutional. Instead of debating motives, he emphasized process. Instead of reacting to accusations, he leaned into procedure. That move matters deeply in American political psychology. When voters see intensity met with composure, many interpret composure as credibility. It does not mean they agree with the substance. It means they perceive steadiness. And in federal hearings involving agencies like the FBI, steadiness often carries symbolic authority. Omar's challenge at that point was not ideological defense. It was tactical recalibration. She needed to slow the tempo without appearing to retreat. That is one of the hardest adjustments to make in real time. If you pivot too quickly, you look shaken. If you press forward too aggressively, you risk overexposure. There is a quiet rule in Washington that experienced lawmakers understand. Never request full transparency unless you are fully confident about the information landscape. Transparency is not a weapon that only cuts one direction. It cuts both ways. The deeper issue unfolding was not whether investigations existed. It was whether she had inadvertently ceded control of narrative sequencing. Narrative sequencing is everything in high-visibility hearings. Whoever introduces specifics first often shapes the memory of the exchange. By insisting on open session specificity, she limited the possibility of strategic containment. In private briefings, ambiguity can be managed. In public session, it becomes spectacle. And spectacle does not distinguish between nuance and risk. Observers in the room began to realize that this was no longer a rhetorical duel. It was becoming a test of endurance. Could she sustain aggressive framing while absorbing procedural counterpoints? Could he maintain calm while under moral accusation? At this stage, the room's silence grew heavier. Not because of explosive revelations, but because of uncertainty about where the exchange was heading. Uncertainty creates psychological tension. Tension amplifies every word spoken next. There is something profoundly revealing about political pressure moments. They strip away prepared talking points. They expose instinct, and instinct is what voters remember long after transcripts fade. Omar's instinct was confrontation. Patel's instinct was procedural control. Those instincts collided under bright lights. It is important to separate drama from consequence here. Political hearings rarely implode careers in a single sentence. What they do is create impressions, and impressions accumulate. If an impression of overreach forms, it lingers. If an impression of steadiness forms, it stabilizes. The long-term implications of that exchange were not immediate scandal. They were narrative vulnerability. Once a public figure appears to misjudge the terrain of a confrontation, critics seize on that perception relentlessly. Supporters defend it. Independents watch quietly. And in American politics, independents often decide the broader arc. What made this moment deep rather than explosive was the recognition that neither side was operating purely emotionally. Both were calculating. Both were aware of audience size. Both understood clip culture. The difference lay in who appeared reactive versus who appeared prepared. Preparation does not always mean having more information. It often means anticipating the other side's emotional trajectory. If you can predict escalation and remain steady through it, you gain visual authority. That is what unfolded here. The hearing did not collapse into chaos. It evolved into controlled tension. And controlled tension is often more politically consequential than open shouting. At this point in the exchange, something subtle but powerful had happened. The narrative had shifted from, "Is the FBI targeting progressives?" to, "Who controls this hearing?" That shift, quiet as it was, would shape everything that followed. By this point in the exchange, the temperature in the room had not exploded, but it had deepened. The confrontation was no longer about rhetorical dominance. It had become about strategic endurance. Political veterans watching from the back rows understood something that casual viewers at home might not immediately grasp. This was the phase where composure either solidifies authority or cracks under accumulated pressure. Omar attempted to pivot. Rather than continuing along the narrow yes or no lane she had initially carved, she widened her framing again, bringing the discussion back to institutional accountability and civil liberties. Strategically, this made sense. When momentum feels uncertain, expanding the frame can diffuse immediate pressure. But expansion has a cost. It risks appearing like retreat if the audience has already locked onto a specific line of questioning. Patel did not chase the pivot. That restraint was deliberate. In political hearings, the temptation to pursue every opening can be fatal. By refusing to escalate into ideological back and forth, he maintained the procedural lane. He kept returning to process, standards, and structure. He avoided moralizing. He avoided personalizing. He anchored the conversation in institutional language. And here is where the deeper psychological layer emerges. Audiences often interpret institutional language as authority, even if they do not fully understand its details. Words like probable cause, review standards, and career agents signal system over personality. That subtle framing shifts attention away from individual motives and toward bureaucratic legitimacy. Whether that legitimacy is universally accepted is secondary to how it feels in the moment. Omar's challenge was compounded by visibility. Millions were watching, not parsing legal nuance, but scanning tone. Was she steady? Was she flustered? Was she controlling the narrative? Every micro-expression mattered. Every pause was magnified. This is where politics becomes theater in the most literal sense. The stage lights do not forgive uncertainty. A single moment of visible recalculation can become the defining clip of the night. Supporters interpret intensity as conviction. Critics interpret it as instability. Independents, who rarely align emotionally with either camp, evaluate something simpler. Who appears more controlled? And control in political combat often wins the optics battle. There was a subtle moment, easy to miss unless you replay it, when Omar paused longer than she had earlier in the exchange. It was not dramatic. It was not catastrophic. But in high-definition, slow-motion media environments, even half-seconds accumulate meaning. That pause suggested recalibration. Patel filled that space not with aggression, but with repetition of process. He did not attack. He did not accuse. He reinforced structure. The contrast sharpened again. This was not a knockout blow scenario. It was attrition. Political attrition is slow erosion of narrative confidence. It happens when the initial aggressor begins reacting instead of directing. And once that dynamic flips, it is extremely difficult to reverse in real time. There is also a strategic irony worth noting. Omar's political identity has long been rooted in challenging institutions, questioning authority, and demanding transparency. Those instincts resonate deeply with her base. But when she confronted an institution represented by someone disciplined enough not to overreact, the confrontation lacked the combustible element necessary for her usual rhetorical style to dominate. Instead of triggering visible institutional defensiveness, she encountered procedural steadiness. That steadiness blunted the moral framing she had prepared. It is not that she lacked argument. It is that the environment did not reward the type of argument she deployed. Observers who study congressional hearings often emphasize one overlooked rule: never assume the emotional terrain will mirror your base. The hearing room is not a rally. It is not a campaign event. It is a structured arena with unpredictable optics. By this stage, both participants understood that the exchange had transcended the original policy topic. It was now about perception management, and perception management requires restraint as much as force. Omar's supporters would later argue that she was unfairly boxed into a narrow frame. Her critics would argue that she overreached. Both interpretations contain elements of truth. But the strategic lesson is simpler. When you demand clarity publicly, you must be prepared for clarity to cut in directions you did not script. The hearing had not imploded. There had been no explosive revelation. But the energy had undeniably shifted. It had moved from accusation to evaluation. And in political combat, evaluation is often the beginning of consequence. By the time the fourth phase of the exchange unfolded, the confrontation had moved beyond simple questioning and response. It had entered the psychological zone, the space where posture, restraint, and stamina matter more than individual lines. What made this stage different was not volume, but fatigue. Extended exchanges in congressional hearings are not only battles of ideology, they are endurance tests. As minutes stretch into segments and segments into headlines, the participants must maintain precision while navigating emotional undercurrents. This is where many public figures falter, not because they lack conviction, but because prolonged pressure erodes rhetorical sharpness. Omar attempted another recalibration. She returned to broader institutional themes: civil liberties, historical precedent, patterns of oversight. The strategy was clear: re-anchor the exchange in principle, rather than remain confined to narrow procedural lanes. That pivot was intelligent. It signaled refusal to concede the narrative frame entirely. But timing is everything. Once perception begins drifting, pivots must be surgical. A pivot that feels even slightly delayed can read as reactive rather than strategic. The audience, consciously or not, begins measuring who appears to be adjusting versus who appears to be holding ground. Patel continued to hold ground. He did not chase rhetorical expansion. He did not escalate emotionally. He reiterated process and oversight mechanisms with disciplined repetition. To critics, that repetition might feel evasive. To supporters, it signals consistency. To neutral observers, it signals composure. And composure under sustained scrutiny often becomes the most powerful visual in the room. The air inside the chamber grew quieter as the exchange matured. It was not the silence of confusion. It was the silence of anticipation. Everyone present understood that prolonged confrontation increases the risk of overreach. The longer one pushes, the more likely a misstep becomes. Here lies the subtle danger Omar faced in this phase. Her political identity thrives on assertiveness. Assertiveness mobilizes energy, but sustained assertiveness without a clear breakthrough can begin to look like force without gain. Viewers start asking internally, what has changed? Has the exchange produced clarity, or has it only amplified tension? In high-stakes oversight environments, clarity is currency. Without visible new information, intensity alone does not guarantee dominance. In fact, if intensity persists without payoff, it can erode perceived control. Meanwhile, Patel's strategy remained minimalistic. Minimalism in political confrontation can be profoundly effective. By limiting emotional variability, he reduced opportunities for visual contrast. No raised eyebrows, no audible frustration, no rhetorical flourish, just structure. This created a powerful optical asymmetry. Omar appeared to be pushing. Patel appeared to be absorbing. In televised dynamics, absorption can appear stronger than aggression, especially when the aggressor does not land a definitive blow. Observers who study political optics often emphasize a counterintuitive principle. The person who appears least disturbed frequently wins the visual narrative, regardless of policy substance. By this point, the debate had transcended its initial content. It was now about resilience under exposure. Both participants understood that clips from this segment would circulate far beyond the hearing room. Every inflection carried future consequences. Omar intensified her questioning tone again, sharpening cadence and narrowing her gaze. It was a calculated effort to reassert command. But there is a threshold in live exchanges where sharpening tone no longer increases leverage. It signals urgency. Urgency is powerful when momentum favors you. It is risky when momentum feels uncertain. Patel's responses remained structured, occasionally invoking statutory language. That choice reinforced an institutional shield. Instead of engaging in emotional reciprocity, he leaned into bureaucratic steadiness. The optics of that steadiness cannot be overstated. In matters involving federal investigations, viewers instinctively associate calm procedural language with authority. This does not make the authority unquestionable. It makes it visually persuasive. The fourth phase, therefore, became a study in contrast: intensity versus steadiness, expansion versus containment, moral framing versus procedural framing. Neither approach is inherently superior, but under the lighting of a congressional chamber, and the amplification of modern media ecosystems, steadiness often photographs better than intensity. The deeper consequence at this stage was not immediate victory or defeat. It was narrative framing. Commentators would later debate whether Omar overextended or whether Patel evaded. Supporters on both sides would extract selective clips. But neutral observers would remember one overarching impression: who looked more in control as the exchange lengthened. And in extended confrontation, control becomes the final metric. As this segment approached its close, the psychological weight of duration began to show. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but subtly. Small recalibrations, slight tonal shifts, micro pauses. Those details are where political narratives are born. The confrontation had not ended in explosion. It had evolved into something quieter and potentially more consequential. The stage was now set for the final stretch, where perception would crystallize and the broader public would decide what they had just witnessed. By the time the fifth phase unfolded, the confrontation had entered its most delicate territory: narrative crystallization. The exchange was no longer developing, it was settling, and when political moments settle, they harden into memory. Omar understood that this was the last window to regain definitive control. Extended exchanges rarely allow endless resets. There comes a point where either a breakthrough occurs or the audience decides the outcome emotionally, even if the policy details remain unresolved. Her tone sharpened again, not louder, but tighter. The phrasing became more direct, less expansive. This was a strategic contraction, an attempt to reclaim tempo. Instead of framing broader systemic concerns, she narrowed her focus back to accountability. It was a calculated shift. Move from theory to responsibility. But here is where the confrontation reached its most subtle climax. Responsibility in a live setting is a double-edged demand. When you demand explicit responsibility, you also risk inviting explicit procedural defense. Patel did not respond with counterattack. He did not accuse. He leaned even further into institutional framing, emphasizing safeguards, review structures, and oversight mechanisms. That repetition was not accidental. It was insulation. And insulation under sustained pressure creates a striking visual dynamic. One participant pushing, the other appearing structurally protected. Viewers may disagree with the substance of that protection, but visually it reads as stability. The room's atmosphere shifted again, not toward eruption, but toward quiet conclusion. That shift matters. Political observers recognize when an exchange has peaked. Once an exchange peaks without dramatic revelation, the narrative becomes about performance rather than content. This was that moment. Omar's final attempts in this segment focused on moral emphasis, reinforcing the broader stakes, invoking the weight of civil liberties, stressing the seriousness of oversight. It was an appeal not just to the official at the table, but to the broader audience watching at home. Yet emotional appeal requires resonance. If the audience has already recalibrated toward evaluating composure, moral intensity alone may not reverse that evaluation. It can energize supporters, but it may not persuade neutral observers who are scanning for steadiness rather than urgency. Meanwhile, Patel's restraint continued. No visible irritation, no rhetorical flourish, just procedural anchoring. In televised politics, the individual who appears least rattled during prolonged scrutiny often inherits the perception of control. It is important to emphasize that perception is not identical to truth. Political optics often diverge from policy depth, but elections and public trust are frequently shaped by perception long before they are shaped by transcripts. The fifth phase, therefore, became less about argument and more about endurance. Who seemed fatigued? Who seemed unwavering? who looked like they had anticipated this confrontation from the beginning. These questions are rarely spoken aloud, but they guide viewer judgment. Omar did not collapse. There was no dramatic misstatement. But the accumulation of intensity without a decisive breakthrough created a subtle vulnerability. When a political figure pushes hard and the exchange ends without a visible shift, critics frame it as overreach. And in the age of clipped media, overreach is a powerful narrative weapon. Patel, whether intentionally or instinctively, avoided providing the explosive moment that might have justified the escalation. By denying emotional reciprocity, he denied dramatic climax. That denial itself became the climax. The hearing room began transitioning toward procedural closure. Staff shuffled papers. The chair prepared to move forward. The energy, once tense, began diffusing. But diffusion does not mean insignificance. Often, the most politically consequential moments are the ones that end without fireworks. They leave space for interpretation. They invite commentators to fill the vacuum. They allow both sides to declare victory. The true consequence of this fifth phase was not immediate applause or outrage. It was narrative ambiguity. And ambiguity in modern politics quickly becomes polarized storytelling. Supporters would later argue that Omar courageously pressed accountability. Critics would argue that she miscalculated tempo and overplayed intensity. Neutral observers would remember something simpler: the contrast in composure as the exchange stretched on. And that contrast, once embedded in public perception, becomes difficult to undo. The confrontation had reached its crest. What remained was resolution, not through explosive revelation, but through the lasting imprint of how both figures carried themselves when the lights were brightest and the pressure was sustained. The final phase would determine whether this moment faded as routine oversight or solidified as a defining visual in the broader political narrative. As the exchange drew toward its conclusion, the intensity did not explode. It condensed. There was no theatrical bang of a gavel that signaled victory or defeat. Instead, there was something far more telling: a settling of posture. The room shifted from confrontation mode into evaluation mode. And in politics, evaluation is where reputations are quietly shaped. By this final stretch, both participants understood that the core substance of the argument had already been presented. What remained was not additional information, but final impression. And final impressions in political hearings are rarely about the last sentence spoken. They are about the emotional residue left behind. Omar made one last attempt to reassert the broader stakes. She emphasized the weight of oversight, the importance of civil liberties, the seriousness of institutional accountability. Her tone was firm, deliberate, and measured, noticeably more controlled than in the earlier acceleration phases. It was not a retreat. It was recalibration. But recalibration at the end of an exchange often functions more as damage control than momentum building. Patel's closing responses remained consistent with his prior strategy. He did not escalate. He did not personalize. He leaned into institutional language, reiterating process, standards, and review mechanisms. His tone never shifted dramatically from where it had started, and that consistency became the quiet takeaway. In prolonged political confrontations, the public rarely remembers every argument. What they remember is who seemed steady as the pressure accumulated, who appeared comfortable inside the spotlight, who looked as though they anticipated the confrontation from the outset, rather than reacting to it. The hearing did not end in applause. It did not end in outrage. It ended in procedural transition, the chair moving on, the next member preparing remarks, papers shuffling. But what lingered was contrast. Intensity versus steadiness, expansion versus containment, moral urgency versus procedural insulation. Neither side conceded ground ideologically. Neither side collapsed. But in the optics of sustained political tension, endurance often becomes indistinguishable from dominance. For Omar, the lesson was not about ideology. It was about terrain. Oversight hearings are structured battlegrounds. They reward precision timing. They punish overextension. They amplify hesitation. They magnify micro shifts in tone. For Patel, the lesson was about discipline. In politically charged environments, emotional neutrality can serve as armor. Whether one agrees with his framing or not, he avoided providing the explosive reaction that might have shifted the narrative dramatically. The larger story is not about who was right on policy. It is about how modern political conflict unfolds under cameras. Today's hearings are not just legislative tools, they are media events. Every exchange is clipped, reframed, reposted, and reinterpreted. A single pause can become a viral symbol. A steady tone can become a headline descriptor. By the end of this confrontation, viewers were no longer debating only the substance of investigations. They were debating performance. And performance in politics often determines influence more quickly than policy details do. Supporters of Omar will argue that she courageously pressed accountability. Critics will argue that she misjudged tempo and overplayed intensity. Supporters of Patel will point to composure. Critics will point to procedural deflection. And that polarization ensures the clip lives on. But for observers seeking strategic insight rather than partisan affirmation, the true takeaway is simpler. Political dominance in televised hearings is rarely achieved through volume. It is achieved through control of rhythm. Once rhythm shifts, regaining it requires either a dramatic breakthrough or flawless recalibration. In this case, there was no dramatic breakthrough, only gradual crystallization of perception. The exchange closed without fireworks, but it did not close without consequence. Because in American political culture, the moments that feel quiet often echo the loudest after the cameras turn off.